Hello, my name's Frank Turnbull. I'm joined with my colleague Andrew Goodson from Griffins. We're, as part of our series on dodging bullets for insolvency professionals, we're looking at this proposal that there may be a sudden marked increase in insolvency appointments coming through once lockdown ends and sort of towards the end of this year. Now, I have to confess we had originally started looking at recording this last year in 2020 when everyone thought that there was a prospect of life getting back to some degree of normality towards the end of the year. But as the cynics and the skeptics sort of maintained, it was going to run through into 2021 and we'll be seeing the effects 2022 and beyond. So as we're now in a position where Boris Johnson has announced his views on when we may be reverting back to some form of normality, it's a good opportunity to take stock of what we think that's going to mean for insolvency appointments later this year, and also what we need to think about as a profession to deal with that increase if it does happen. So it's a good starting point, Andrew, is if we think about times we've seen this before and the sort of indicative evidence or behaviours that it's prompted in business owners and individuals when it comes down to their own insolvent positions.
Yes, well, the upturn in insolvencies is usually a sign that a particularly troubled economic period has come to an end. Generally, you don't see the huge number of insolvencies on the way in. It's as the economy starts to come out and effectively it shakes down. Those that haven't been able to weather the storm tend to fall by the wayside, and others will go on from strength to strength. And in this instance, there's a couple of points that have caused people to think that's likely to happen. The first is we saw throughout 2020, and there's some indication in 2021 as well, that the overall economy, the GDP, has taken a huge hit. And with that sort of hit, coupled with the fact that large parts of the economy were just simply shut down for a significant period last year, means that people are expecting there'll be a number of businesses that will struggle, because there's always certain liabilities which accrue month on month, be it rates or taxes or rent or so on and so forth, which would have been building up at a time when many people couldn't trade. However, the last time we did have a big recession back in 2008, there was far more government assistance to try and, to borrow a phrase from the health side of what we've gone through, flatten the curve, where the aim was to stop a huge spike in insolvencies. And what it did create that was marked on at the time was the zombie companies, where they sort of rolled along. They probably should be in insolvency, but the directors aren't going to put them into a voluntary liquidation. They no longer have the assets to warrant an administration, but no creditors really have the spare funds to bother winding them up, particularly if it doesn't look like there's going to be a return to creditors. And so I think one of the prime drivers of whether there will be a tsunami or not of new cases is exactly how the government responds. Because so far, the government's put so much support into the economy that if that was to continue in a similar vein, then one can see them flattening the curve and it won't be quite as marked as perhaps some others were expecting.
I mean, that's true. If you have a situation where over the course of the last year everyone's been treading water with some form of financial assistance from the government, it does mean that at the very end, if there's a decision made by those individuals to not continue trading and to simply forfeit any sort of future trading ability and walk away from the liabilities, I imagine the government will simply be the largest creditor and the largest stakeholder in the outcomes of that. So their high-level policy will be determining what happens next. By that logic, there could be a flood of insolvencies, but there could be a flood of insolvencies where there's very little creditor interest because there's nothing left. You know, any assets have dwindled over the intervening 18 months, and there's no real sort of value to any of the sort of remaining fixed assets or conventional things like any machinery, because there could be entire sectors which are just no longer able to trade anymore. I mean, that's possibly getting ahead of ourselves. There's a lot of different ways in which this could go. But I think the clear point is the government, via the provision of the furlough scheme, via the provision of the business bounce back loans, and via HMRC gaining a sort of a new preferential status on various forms of claim, are sitting there with a lot of control over whether companies should or should not carry on trading. I think I'm also aware that there was that period of 2 months last year where the courts ceased to function, and at that point, HMRC couldn't proceed with any of their winding up petitions. And I understand they may have well withdrawn a lot of their winding up petitions last year. And if that's the case, there could be a flood of work for the Treasury solicitor to deal with, which could then lead to a lot of sort of a high volume, low value series of insolvencies. I mean, that's once the Treasury solicitor has finished sorting out Brexit, of course. If that is the case, that potentially creates a bit of a challenge for the profession, because there could be a perception that insolvency could be quite busy, but equally it may not be busy in a way that actually sort of puts more work over to us. What do you think?
Yes, I think you've highlighted there a couple of the key points that I would follow up on. The first, the last point you make is, I think it's undoubted that, assuming HMRC make the decisions we'd expect them to at some point, and I'll come on to that in a moment, the insolvency service certainly will get busier, because if you think about it, if the HMRC decide they want to catch up, they're going to have all of those winders that were in the system when they decided to withdraw them all last year. All of the winding up petitions they might have wanted to present during the last year or just under a year, but they haven't been able to because of the legislation preventing a large amount of winding up petitions going in. And then on top of that, new winding up petitions in relation to what's happening going forwards as we start to come out. You can see the court list being even more full than usual with HMRC petitions, which will invariably fall onto the insolvency service. And if there aren't a significant number of cases with assets within that pool, then they're going to stay with the insolvency service more and potentially cause the insolvency service issues with deciding exactly which cases to focus on when they're looking at their regulatory regime. And then coming back to the early point I was going to make there as well, is that HMRC, as you've said, are almost going to become kingmaker in the industry going forwards, where because they've got so much that's going to be owed to them for the various support schemes, the deferral of tax, and them being a preferential or second preferential creditor, it means that as a profession, we are going to have to get probably even better than any of us are now at both communicating with HMRC and persuading them that what we think is the appropriate course, both before and after appointment, is the one that's in their best interest as well.
Now, of course, communicating with HMRC is sometimes like shouting into the void. But there is as I understand it, HMRC are very live to the issues, and I think R3 has done quite a lot of work in trying to sort of communicate with them, as have the regulators. And there is a strong possibility that at the end of this, HMRC will be in a better position to support the insolvency profession in taking on the appointments and sort of coming up with practical solutions and engaging with the practical solutions. But of course, we have to wait and see how that is going to work, because there will be, if they are inundated with other issues, then despite any best plans, it may still be very unworkable for them to engage. One of the things you touched on there was I think also going to be quite relevant, possibly moves into what creditor expectations are going to be. Creditors are rightly going to expect that in any insolvency, the insolvency practitioners will do their level best to try and recover as much as possible and pursue any claims that may be available. But they may have unrealistic expectations in terms of what can be done. And that may in particular point towards things like furlough fraud and the bounce back loan scheme. If there's a misappropriation of any funds, which then increases liabilities, there may be a perception that directors should simply be pursued for their personal contribution. I wonder whether commercially that's going to be as possible as creditors might think, and whether we need to do some work towards expectation management.
I would agree. If you take bounce back loans as an example, the upper limit for most of the bounce back loans was £50,000. And at that level, if you're dealing with, say, an unfunded estate where the solicitors and any barristers are going to be on CFAs and uplifts, and there's going to be ATE presumably because the IP is not going to want to put themselves at risk, then if you then allow, say, the director might want to settle but might want to go to trial, you could very quickly eliminate all of the possible recovery with the costs and then some. And so it might not be commercial to pursue it. And at that point, I think one of the real bullets for the profession to dodge is, as you said, managing creditor expectations through, I think, very clear messages in progress reports and other communications with creditors, explaining that yes, you do agree there is a potential issue here, but here are the factors that belie the reality of the situation as to why it may not be in the best interest for an office holder to pursue that matter. Now, in this day and age, we have various other options. One can go to litigation funders who might even purchase the claim, or one could offer to assign the claim, possibly for an amount, or to creditors. And if we come back to the point we made earlier, HMRC is going to be a significant creditor in a number of estates, then I don't think the IP could be criticised for offering to assign the claim back to HMRC. And we could even, who knows, if they decide they want to go down that route for the PR side of still pursuing people, that might be a way to deal with those situations and get the best outcome for everyone.
And HMRC do have better tools to pursue in that sort of way, and also there are previous examples. For instance, some of the tax avoidance schemes via employee benefit trusts. HMRC did recover powers there to pursue directors directly, which will have caused some issues for any IPs who would have been looking to form claims on that basis, but equally may have made it easier for HMRC to recover funds. And I think there's other examples in government institutions like the Information Commissioner's Office, for instance. They've been seeking additional powers to pursue directors for their part in the loss suffered. So in a way, bypassing insolvency, which may assist their ability to get funds back in and may also streamline what IPs can pursue. But I think that's going to be a thing for future development. I agree that managing creditor expectations is very key, and I think any insolvency practitioner in any appointment is best placed to do that. But to do that, they need to make sure that they're communicating clearly with creditors. They're providing creditors some confidence that they will always undertake the work in an impartial and objective manner, because there is, as ever, the risk, as we know, that creditors will be sceptical of any company where the directors have approached that company to put the company into liquidation, and there's always a perception that there may be information which is being sort of swept under the carpet. But the entirety of the profession is abiding by the same code of conduct, the same sort of ethical expectations, and I think that the best way to shore up any creditor concern there is simply to be as open and as informative and as helpful as possible, which is sort of easy observations to give, particularly when anyone has ever been involved in managing creditor complaints in any way. There is I suppose the secondary aspect that's now come into play is Brexit. It's unavoidable. It's there every day. We've seen its impact onto various different businesses, and you can go from the attention, sort of the headline grabbing ones about bees not being imported from Italy, right the way through to issues with fishing stocks up in Scotland. But how do you think we best incorporate Brexit into our work on companies going into liquidation and individuals becoming insolvent in 2021?
I think it will come in a couple of ways. The first is, I think if there is a Brexit angle, so if you have a business that has a significant trading relationship with countries that remain in the EU, then I think it's quite likely that most of the creditors are going to be somewhat sympathetic to that and trying to find a way to deal with it, in the same way as where there are businesses that have issues caused by COVID, most creditors understand that it's just something everyone's got to go through, and generally there's a bit more forgiveness, for want of a better phrase, sort of tolerance for dealing with matters. And I think that the other main issue there is just acknowledging that huge uncertainty. So when trying to make plans for, be it voluntary arrangements or plans for trading and administration and things like that, there's got to be, a huge amount of caution over exactly what those effects might be. And of course, none of us really know, because we're all still feeling our way in. And then I think the other major issue for the industry to be aware of would be, and this would apply to Brexit and COVID as well, is to test when they are given as a reason for an insolvency, particularly if a company is going into a voluntary liquidation and the director says, "Oh well, Brexit, flawed my company." Just make sure that's the case. It's happened previously where I've seen where a pizza restaurant in Chelmsford in Essex in 2003 was blaming the terror attacks in 2001 on the Twin Towers for his business failing. Now, once you actually look into it, that's not really the case. And here the important thing is not, particularly if we do start to get busier as an industry and we're taking more instructions from companies and directors, is not to have the public look at us as being under the influence of the directors and just acting in their interests all the time. And so testing those sorts of explanations early can allow you to put something that's actually a bit more accurate, a bit more nuanced into the creditor reports, so that it stops creditors contacting you saying, well, actually, that's a load of rubbish. If you'd looked at it at all, you'd know the real reason is A, B, C.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think that I suppose the other thing that comes out of the Brexit impact is that we don't know also how best we're going to be able to deal with the impact on some of our cases. I sat in on a seminar yesterday by Enterprise Chambers, which gave some details as to how we'd be looking at sort of contracts and enforceability of contracts in law. And I have to say that it does look like a bit of a minefield. And if I think back to any time we've dealt with interjurisdictional matters, I now look back upon those and I'm sort of grateful that we were dealing with them before Brexit, I have to say. I mean, the problem is, of course, it's a highly emotive and still highly politicised matter. So anyone who engages with it in that sort of way. It's very hard to be objective on the impact of that, and I think we will see that effect over 2021. But I do agree, people may well be looking to use it as yet another contributory factor for some business failures, and it will be very important to separate those 2 points out. So, turning around to the practical implications of these points, which I think we've covered as we've been discussing it, one thing that bothers me, or is of sort of greatest concern, is how we deal with advice. I think over the last 15 months, there's been a great increase in the amount of advice provided. The statistics show out an increase in sort of voluntary arrangements for companies, and there's been occasional spikes there in terms of insolvency appointments need to be borne out. But I think mostly it's advice, with people seeking advice over the course of the last year with a view to taking some direct action once they know what the recovery phase is going to be like. And I think that my experience of that so far has been seeing situations where people have simply given bad advice in the profession. I provided some guidance for a particular client who had their client who hadn't been advised properly on furlough and liquidation and the protection of furlough rights in liquidation, which is concerning. And without suggesting that there is a risk here that we have people who are simply providing what they think is right, simply to be seen to be giving advice. How do we best counter the fact that people are coming to us as professionals expecting us to have all the answers when it's very difficult to do that?
I think as an opening point, as a profession, so long as we remain honest to the fact that we're not always going to know the answer, and at times just saying, I don't know, is going to be the best option, because if you try and come up with what you think might be the best answer, that might be a problem down the road. And in relation to that, and picking up a point you just made, is I think really trying to get a grip on any advice anyone who comes to see you, any advice they have already received from someone else. Because I think if we can deal with bad advice already given and correct that, we can perhaps provide a better service to those that come to us. One point with 2 sub-points that springs to my mind is around the time the bounce back loans were first being rolled out, the Treasury did a Q&A session where they answered a number of questions put to them by the press, and there was a lot of confusion or uncertainty around exactly what they could be used for, because the vague description was they could be used for any legitimate business expenditure. And I saw 2 specific points made which did cause me concern. The first was a director said, well, if I'm the director of the company, I've personally guaranteed the overdraft. Can I repay that and take out this new bounce back loan so that the only real difference is now that I'm no longer personally guaranteeing? And the Treasury said, yes, that's fine. And the second one was someone said their company had declared a dividend because the accounts showed the appropriate distributable reserves, but they didn't actually have the cash to pay themselves that dividend, where it's a small company where the directors are the shareholders. Could they obtain the loan to pay the dividend? And again, the Treasury response was, yes, that's a usual business expenditure. Now, if someone is taking on advice like that, that definitely does not always apply to if a company is in financial difficulty and heading for insolvency. Obviously, the first example there starts to look a lot like a preference for the director, and the second example could well be misfeasance for making the payment at a time when actually, notwithstanding that there were the distributable reserves at the time the accounts were prepared to declare the dividend, if the company doesn't have the finances now to pay it, that can cause them issues. So I think as an industry, if we can try and take in all the advice someone's received before, but still be honest and say at times, I honestly don't know what the best answer is for you here, and maybe send them to other more specialist advisors, be it within insolvency or different sectors, or an accountant or lawyer, what have you, I think is almost certainly going to be the best way forward.
That does make sense. You've just thrown up the very tantalising prospect of somebody suing the Treasury for providing bad advice, which I would love to see. I think the other thing that follows on is that we need to be very, I think, wise to our employees, well, not only the mental health from working remotely, but also skills and experience and training. A lot of the skills and experience that people have built up over time may have started to drift, or may have become less, people may feel less confident in what they used to do, simply because they won't have had that exposure over the last 15 months. And this could be the mundane things like, assessing income and expenditure for someone who's an IVA specialist, right the way up to looking and sort of judging what asset values are if you're dealing with sort of a breakup and sale of an engineering plant. The situations are extremely wide-ranging, as we know from the work that we do. I think that everybody does need to look to how people do their work and sort of consider whether there is the need for any additional training, or whether there's a need for just a review of the skills needed and the any additional training that may be needed by employees to be ready for the work when the work goes back to some degree of normality, when we are doing things more on site, where we are doing things more face to face. This isn't suggesting that somehow over the last 15 months there's been a sort of collective bout of amnesia when it comes down to how you do your job, but I think that some things which are habitual will have ceased to be habitual, and because we all rely on a sort of on-the-job training and we all share information in a very collaborative way, there is a risk that if we're suddenly confronted by this sudden surge of work, that it will be very easy for people suddenly to forget small things that maybe will help them on their way, and that may then lead to people not being quite sufficient or quite as effective in the work or they do, or the advice they provide. But I think that's just it's an observation that I feel has come out of discussions that we've had about the challenges of remote working and about how you share that information. And of course, there's still no guarantee that there will be this so-called tsunami of insolvencies. And I think as we're coming to conclude, can't really say whether, do we think there will be a tsunami, or do we think there will be a washout? Do we think there'll be, it will just simply revert to business as usual, or do we think there's going to be increased work? I think my view is there will be, based on the government decision, there may be an increase in insolvencies that will flood the insolvency service, but that will not have a noticeable knock-on effect to insolvency practitioners. And I think insolvency firms generally may see a rise in some rescue work, and we'll see a rise in CVLs, and we'll see a rise in sort of restructuring advice. And I think, I suppose in a second area, there may be a rise in some claims, but there'll be an issue about commerciality of claims. That's my takeaway from this, but I'm perfectly happy to be proven wrong. as the year progresses.
Yeah, I think for myself, I'm expecting a marked increase in the headline insolvencies when the large, big firms go down that occupies the big four and the next few underneath that. And I think perhaps they are, because some of the noises that have come out of the recruitment market at the moment is that the larger firms are starting to look for talent now, which would suggest they're expecting to get busier soon. And what they don't want to do is wait until, if there is a tsunami, they're in the middle of the wave when everyone's trying to recruit and you start to have to pay more. I don't know how much of that will, to borrow an economics phrase, I don't know how much of it will trickle down to the SME sector. There will be an uptick, if only because at the moment we're in a very low period. The amount of insolvencies at the moment are very low. So there will be an increase from where we are now, if only as a regression to the mean. I wouldn't be surprised if we go a bit above that, but I don't think we're going to have an absolute swamping at the lower end of the market than perhaps some people might be expecting.
And of course, we've barely touched on personal insolvency, but that's the other thing. We could, at this point, be talking about the impact onto so many other different areas. We haven't touched on the impact on the high street and the decline in the high street that predated the lockdown and Brexit. Equally, there's issues about asset valuations and various other areas which are touched on by the current situation. So I think we'll just have to come back to this point at some point in the future once some of these areas are better known. But I think that's it's a useful area to explore, and I think I'm going to be very interested to see how 2021 develops, and I'm going to be very interested to see whether the government decides to try and take control of this particular situation, and maybe given the time of recording, we're due a new budget, and we'll see what the plans are for yet further financial support. It could be that everything we're discussing now is actually more relevant for 2022 than it is for 2021. So I think it only remains to say thank you for anyone who's joined and watched. And if you do have any questions or issues, I believe our contact details have been provided along with this. Do feel free to get in touch, and we will be more than happy to discuss any of the points raised. Thank you.
Thank you.